Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the CES Letters podcast. My name is Easton, and wherever and whenever you're listening, I welcome you to this podcast. Today we have an incredible teacher with us today. His name is Stephen O. Smoot, and he is an adjunct instructor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University and a doctoral candidate in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature at the Catholic University of America. He earned a master's degree from the University of Toronto in Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations and bachelor's degrees from Brigham Young University in Ancient Near Eastern Studies and German Studies. Outside academia, Stephen has worked as research associate with Book of Mormon Central and the B. H. Roberts Foundation. Now, my friends, I'm super excited about this podcast, but even more so, this is the first of 3 different episodes with Stephen. He is a genius when it comes to the Book of Abraham. And today we look at some of the first claims that are in the CES letter about the Book of Abraham. Specifically, we look at kind of what was the translation process, what does it mean, and how come there's some of the different, as Jeremy Rennells talks about, how come some of these crazy and these foolish things are found in the Book of Abraham. And so, as always, we invite you, as you study this, to go and check out the supplementary letter that Stephen wrote, and to further your study by going to the show notes and looking at some of those additional resources that we have there. Go to the footnotes of Stephen's article and look at some of the resources that he has there. If you want to find answers to your questions, you can find them, but it takes both study and faith. And so continue your study, but then also include faith into these things. This is a spiritual topic that takes spiritual means to get there. So without further ado, I present to you the Book of Abraham with Stephen Smoot. All right, Stephen, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, Easton. How are you?
I'm doing good. Number one, I just want to thank you for being here with us on the CES Letters podcast. And I want to thank you for your expertise with what we're talking about. You've put a lot of time and effort and study and everything to give us a fine and an academic response. So thank you for that as well.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. Thank you for the compliment. At any point in my life, I could have gone and become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. But, as a young kid, I said, I don't want to make money when I'm an adult. So I'm going to become an Egyptologist and specialize on Book of Abraham stuff. That,
right.
I just had that driving passion within me to, live destitute my entire life. But I'm glad to hear that there are some who appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Well, it is helpful for us, even though you might not be making the most money. I wish we could give you some for being here today. But thank you for your time. At the very least,
my pleasure.
And I want to hear a little bit about that, kind of your journey to this.
Yeah, sure.
But before we hear that, I want you just to answer this question.
Okay.
What is something that nobody else knows about you, or not very many people know about you?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, maybe some people know about this about me, but it is kind of obscure.
Okay.
So my last name, Smoot, I share the name with a fellow named Oliver Smoot, no relation as far as I'm aware. And back in 1958, Oliver Smoot, he was a student at MIT, and as part of a fraternity pledge, they measured, his fraternity brothers used him to measure the length of the Harvard Bridge in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? I think it bridges Cambridge and Boston, right out there by MIT. They measured the length of the bridge in him. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and so they marked off a cross length of the bridge in smoots, right? And so the smoot has become a unit of measurement because Oliver Smoot went on to sort of work for the U.S. Department of Standards or something like that, right? And so a smoot is a unit of length that's 5 feet 7 inches long, and you can measure things in smoots based off of this guy, Oliver Smoot. And so people ask me, well, how tall are you? I am 1.09 smoots tall.
Awesome.
So that's kind of fun, right? So I do, and in fact, I've been to the Harvard Bridge out there in Cambridge, and I've laid down it, the same place that Oliver Smoot laid down. So I guess that's kind of the fun thing that maybe not a lot of people know about me is the fact that I proudly share my name with a silly little non-standard unit of measurement that you can measure things in, specifically length. So there you go.
That's really cool. That's a very interesting thing. I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I guess my second question, kind of going along with this, is you are an Egyptologist. You have dedicated your life to this. You could have went off and done something. You could have become a millionaire. I'm sure
Yeah.
you wanted to.
At any point along the road, I could have bailed. Yeah.
And you still can.
I did.
I'll give you that opportunity.
Yeah, that's right.
You need.
Not too late.
But why would you do that? To kind of give me or give the audience, what has that process looked like for you? How did you go from being probably some cute little 2-year-old to the point where you're an academic Egyptologist?
Right. So I suppose my interest in all of this really sort of started as a teenager. Because as a teenager, I discovered a fellow by the name of Hugh Nibley, a name that probably many listeners are aware of. And I never met Hugh Nibley because he died right when I sort of discovered who he was and started reading his books. But I discovered who Hugh Nibley was, and that kind of launched me into this world of the ancient Near East, ancient scripture, the Hebrew Bible, the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Mormon, all of that, kind of that world that Hugh Nibley explored, I discovered as a teenager. Now, I have a family friend by the name of Richard Holtzapfel, who's a former BYU professor in the Department of Ancient Scripture at BYU. He and my dad were missionary companions in Italy back in the 1970s, and so the Holtzapfels and the Smoots have been family friends. And Richard did a terrible thing. When I discovered who Hugh Nibley was, Richard acted as my dealer. He would supply me with the latest publications of Hugh Nibley, or the BYU, the Religious Studies Center, was doing, which he was the director of at one point, as I understand. Or he would give me the latest publications coming out of FARMS, the Foundation for Ancient Research in Mormon Studies, which, was a thing back then. And so this just kind of snowballed into this passion for wanting to understand ancient texts, ancient cultures, and especially our scriptures, right? You crack open our triple combination, or you crack open our Bible, and you enter this fascinating world of antiquity that I wanted to learn more about. And so really that, I would say, long story short, that kind of catalyzed my interest in this. And so I entered BYU after I came back from my mission. And right off the bat, I was an ancient Near Eastern studies major. I knew I wanted to study the world of the Old Testament, the world of ancient Israel, including ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, Canaan, that whole sort of world, right? Now, when you go into academia, you're obviously encouraged and you have to sort of find what your niche is, right? So you start broad and then you get more general and general. And I just sort of gravitated towards ancient Egypt because of the fascinating connections with the Book of Abraham, right, in our Pearl of Great Price. It's the one book of scripture we have that has pictures in it, right? And so every time you open it, there's some interesting pictures that are facing you. So that sort of sparked my interest and imagination. The academic literature and the debate around the Book of Abraham fascinated and interested me, right? In some ways, the Book of Abraham is kind of like a puzzle to be solved, right? How did we get this? Where did it come from? What do we know about it? And so that interested me. And also to be very candid, right? Many people have questions and concerns with the Book of Abraham. People would come to me and ask me questions. What do you think about this? And I wanted to be able to understand it as best as I could in order to help answer the questions that other people had when they came to me. And so that kind of, that wasn't the only factor, but that was a major factor as well to kind of want to push me in this direction towards making Egyptology my, or one of my concentrations of academic study, right? And so sort of the two areas that I specialize in are the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and ancient Egypt. And I focus on how these two ancient cultures interacted, how Egypt appears in the Bible, where it appears in the Bible, the connections the Israelites had with the Egyptians. So that's all fascinating from sort of a non-LDS vantage point of my academic work with my, like my non-LDS work. But, there's obvious bridges with my LDS work as well, or my LDS-oriented work, I should say, with the Pearl of Great Price and things like that. So hopefully that gives kind of a quick rundown, right, of sort of what sort of derangement drove me into this very niche subdiscipline of academia. It basically boils down to, as a teenager, I was exposed to this. I thought it was fascinating. It was really fun. It was interesting. It was steadily supplied to me and encouraged by me by family and friends and academic peers of mine, professors of mine. And then, at any point along the way, I could have jumped off and gone in some other discipline, but I thought I'm going to stick with it, see how far it goes. And I've been very fortunate and blessed to end up where I am now, which is a specialist in this field. And it's been a great time. No regrets so far, except for maybe not making lots of money, but that's okay. I make up for in other ways.
And by the way, you are a specialist in this work. You're one of the smartest people, I would say, on the face of the planet. And
that's really nice of you.
That's why we've gotten you, is because you are such an expert when it comes to the things that we're talking about today.
Well, if that's the case, I have to say, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and there's other peers of mine working with me right now who I give a lot of credit to them as well for doing tremendous work. I'm just a young pup in this, right? There's been guys who've been around here for, even before I was born, there's been scholars who've been working on this, but I appreciate that nonetheless. Thank you.
And you're humble too.
I try to be, at least, yeah.
Okay, so as we jump in today, we will be talking about the Book of Abraham, as you've kind of mentioned, and we will be talking with Stephen about 3 different topics within the Book of Abraham. This is episode 1 of 3, and so if you like this one, make sure to go listen to the other 2. But we hope that some of your questions and concerns, the truth seekers who may be listening, we hope that your answers can be found here. As we also get started, I'd also like to point out that along with this podcast, there's a supplementary letter that Stephen wrote. It's an excellent letter that you can continue your study with. He has incredible footnotes as well as a part of his letter. So if you want to dive even deeper into what we've talked about today, make sure to go and check out his letter. But Stephen, as we get started with the Book of Abraham, we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of the translation and what exactly does the CES letter say about the Book of Abraham, and you start your letter off, and it says the Book of Abraham is the single best source of answers for the age-old questions: where did we come from, and why are we here?
Right.
Could you tell us why? Could you kind of give just that preface, that underlining preface, as we get started?
Yeah. Well, basically, if you look at our standard works, our books of Scripture, the Book of Abraham gives us the clearest picture of what happened in the premortal realm, right? Mm-hmm. So as Latter-day Saints, we have this belief, this faith in a premortal existence, that we lived with God before we came here on earth, that a plan was presented for us to accept or to reject, and that we have a specific purpose here on earth that is setting us up in a trajectory to return back to God, right? So the nice little plan of salvation that you learn about in primary and that you probably taught or that people teach on their missions, that is most clearly articulated in the Book of Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price. You get hints of it in other books of Scripture, of course. You get other discussions about it in other places. But sort of this roadmap, this sort of cosmic roadmap of premortal existence into mortality is most clearly laid out in the Book of Abraham. And so for that reason alone, the Book of Abraham is important and worthwhile for us as Latter-day Saints. If that's all we had from it, then that would be valuable enough. But there's, of course, much more that it brings to the discussion, theologically speaking. But I thought it would be appropriate to highlight that fact, that if we don't have the Book of Abraham, we have a big gaping hole in our scriptural knowledge of where we came from, why are we here, and where are we going.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And while the doctrine may be important and it is vital with the Book of Abraham, it is also a controversial book of Scripture,
yes,
I would say. Mm-hmm. And in the CES letter, it says, and I'm going to read this quote from the CES letter, it says, quote, Joseph Smith got everything wrong about the papyri, the facsimiles, the names, the gods, the scene context, the fact that the papyri and facsimiles were 1st century CE funerary text, who was male, who was female, etc. It's gibberish. There is not one single non-LDS Egyptologist who supports Joseph's Book of Abraham, its claims, or Joseph's translations. Even LDS Egyptologists acknowledge that there are serious problems with the Book of Abraham and Joseph's claims. Close quote.
Right.
That's a powerful
absolutely.
Right there.
Yeah.
And you then go on to tell us that while this evokes emotion, it distorts truth.
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of go into what is the Book of Abraham? What did that translation look like? What is the Joseph Smith papyri? What are the facsimiles? What are the names in the Book of Mormon? You talk about the gods of the Book of Abraham, the Latter-day Saint Egyptologists in the Book of Abraham, and so on and so forth. Those are the main sections that you talk about in your letter. So I say we just jump in.
Sure.
Help us understand why that distorts the truth. His
Right. Well, I suppose I should start by saying that the way the CES letter frames this issue, that quote that you just read, that says that Joseph Smith didn't get anything right. He blew everything. It's a total fiasco, right?
It's gibberish.
It's gibberish, right? The magnitude in which the CES letter presents the problem, I must say, is it's wildly overreaching and overclaiming, right, in what the actual problem is, okay? So I'm not coming here to say that there is no issue or controversy, or that there are no questions for us to sort of grapple with here. But this overwhelmingly, damningly negative assessment that the CES letter gives, where the author says, right, there's nothing about it he got right, he got everything wrong, that's a simple, wild overstatement, okay? So if we do a little bit of intellectual history, if we step back in the 1960s, again with a guy named Hugh Nibley, so the Joseph Smith papyri fragments that we now have today in Salt Lake City at the Church History Library, they were returned to the church in November of 1967, okay? So that's like what, coming up 60-something years ago now, right? So that's 60 years of Latter-day Saints, starting with Hugh Nibley and continuing on today with myself and many of my wonderful colleagues I work with. There's almost 60 years of scholarship that Latter-day Saint scholars have done on the Book of Abraham to demonstrate where even if we can't prove the book is true, and I wouldn't claim that we can prove it's true, quote unquote, prove it's true, which ones some people want, we can't prove it's true, but what we can do is show here are several points of convergence where the text Joseph Smith produced finds confirmation or finds complementary harmony with our knowledge of the ancient world, okay? The world of Abraham of, let's say, circa 2000 BC, Middle Bronze Age in Canaan and Egypt, right? So that'd be Middle Kingdom Egypt for those keeping track, right? So we have this work on the historicity of the text that's been done for the last 60 years. And the points of convergence are multiple and they are compelling, okay? We have work being done on the nature of the translation. What do we know about how the Book of Abraham was translated? What can we say about that? That's still a big sort of mystery to help that we're trying to still unravel here, right? We don't know all the details still, just because of the nature of the documentary record that has survived to us. But we know more than we know more now than we did then, right? And so we can say things about what is and what is not likely as the scenario for how the Book of Abraham was translated. We know a lot about, actually, this is actually very significant, we know a lot about the owners of the ancient papyri Joseph Smith had, whose names appear in the papyri fragments we have. So we can actually reconstruct the names, the genealogies, and the sort of the occupations of these people that own these papyri that Joseph Smith came into possession. And those...
so meaning like the people way back...
So the people, thanks for asking to clarify. I should say, the papyri fragments that the church recovered, that Joseph Smith owned, what we know we have, or what we know that Joseph Smith had, those papyri fragments date to what's called the Ptolemaic period. So for those of you who know your classical history, right, Ptolemy was one of the generals of Alexander the Great, and after Alexander the Great's death, Ptolemy sort of set up a dynasty in ancient Egypt, right? So Egypt had been conquered by Alexander, and Ptolemy established a dynasty, and it's called the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was from around, roughly 330 to 30 BC. So 330 to 30 BC, the Ptolemaic period. The papyri fragments from the scrolls we have that Joseph Smith had date to that time period.
Cool.
We know who owned them, and we know something about who they were. And actually, it's really significant that we know that, right? So we can say stuff about that. It has implications for our Book of Abraham text. I've written about it, and others have at length. So this is all to say, to kind of wrap up my point here, right off the bat, my problem with the CES letter and how it frames the issue is it takes this totalizing perspective of it is completely game over for the Book of Abraham, right? That is just simply not the case. I'm sorry. So if you're going to start with the CES letter's perspective, you're in trouble because you're going to run into data and evidence that contradicts this. And the CES letter does not account for that, right? And I say this again and again in my letter addressing this point. The CES letter does not account for this evidence that myself and others have adduced to establish the historicity of the Book of Abraham, to understand something about the Joseph Smith papyri, and to understand the method of translation that Joseph Smith used. So right off the bat, I guess that would be my opening sort of riposte to this point made in the CES letter, is to say that is a powerful narrative. It's a powerful claim, and many people find that claim persuasive. I encounter it all the time when people tell me this. I'm here to tell you it's not true. It distorts reality to claim that it's this like doomsday scenario for the Book of Abraham. It's just simply not true.
Awesome. That is a powerful statement, and I'm excited to hear kind of your reasons for it. And again, I'm going to be jumping back and forth from kind of our conversation and your letter and the CES letter. And so in your letter, you say specifically, Jeremy Rennells, the author of the CES letter, he assumes that the fragments that have been studied are the source for the Book of Abraham. That assumption is unsound and unproved.
Yes.
Could you explain that just a little bit? What fragments do we have, and what sources did he use for the translation?
Right.
What is the difference between those?
So the fragments we now have in our possession that were recovered and returned to the church in 1967, they've been translated, they've been studied by both Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint Egyptologists. So there is consensus about what these fragments say, right? I've read the fragments myself as when trained in the ancient Egyptian language. So I can read them, others can read them. There's no controversy there. The fragments we have are copies of what are commonly called, quote, funerary texts by Egyptologists, meaning texts that were buried or deposited with the dead upon their burial, right? And they were subsequently rediscovered in a funerary context, meaning they were excavated in a tomb, right? They were discovered in a tomb or a funerary context. These funerary texts are called today by Egyptologists the Book of the Dead and the Book of Breathings, okay? I won't get into the ins and outs of what these books specifically are, but the gist of it is that they were texts meant to help guide the deceased through the afterlife to become glorified and exalted as a deity, if you want to say it in that way, right? So we have these texts. We know what they say. There's no controversy about that. So nobody is claiming that, oh, well, maybe they actually could translate as our Book of Abraham, right? Or match it. No one's saying that. Rather, the big question that people are still debating is what papyrus fragments or scrolls, because we know Joseph Smith owned multiple, right? He bought more than just one. He bought multiple scrolls. Which of these scrolls did he understand or think he was translating and producing the Book of Abraham? And even second to that, what did he mean by that when he said, I'm translating these records? Because for Joseph Smith, usage of the word translation does not always exactly mean what we might mean today when we talk about translation. For Joseph Smith, sometimes translation is more akin to what we would call revelation. He received a revelatory manifestation connected to this. So those are the two questions people are debating, and there is considerable debate. So the point I wanted to make here in addressing the CES letter is to say that Jeremy Rennells takes for granted that the papyrus fragments that were recovered in the 1960s are the source of the Book of Abraham. Now, if that's the case, then yes, that seems very problematic for Joseph Smith because Egyptologists can translate them and they do not translate as our Book of Abraham, right? But that assumption or that argument has been challenged. I think it's been vigorously and convincingly challenged. We cannot say for sure that actually these are the fragments that we think Joseph Smith thought he was trying to translate. That's still an open question. So if you begin with this assumption that these are the papyrus fragments Joseph Smith was using and they don't translate as the Book of Abraham, therefore the Book of Abraham is false, which is the narrative that the CES letter takes, that makes sense as sort of a narrative or an assumption, but it's an assumption, and it's one that has been challenged. The evidence for that, I think, is actually pretty thin. There is some you can point to that may seem to indicate this, but it's questionable. And, for lack of, or for the sake of time, I would, refer readers or listeners to read my book and others that have come out recently on this and to read the sources quoted in the letter I wrote responding to the CES letter, which is to basically call into question that unsound narrative or assumption that Rennells takes for granted, right? Again, going back to my earlier point, Rennells presents this as if it's game over for the Book of Abraham. I'm not convinced that that's at all the case. I'm not at all convinced that we can prove that the papyrus fragments we have today are the source Joseph Smith was attempting to translate. I think it's still an open question. We still have many gaps in our knowledge of the historical sources that have survived to us. There's debate about how to interpret them, and so on and so forth. So that's what I kind of mean with that statement when I say this is an unproven and unsound assumption that Runnels just takes for granted. And it may be the case, but I am doubtful that it is.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest with people, Runnels and others have to acknowledge that fact and not just present it as if there's no contest or question or controversy at all.
Mm-hmm. Something we're really focusing on here at the CES Letters podcast and on our whole website and the letters is what do we know and how do we know it?
Right.
And Jeremy and others and the CES letter, they claim things that they say that they know, but there's no way that we can know those things yet with what we have right now. So I appreciate your insight into this. From here, I'd like to kind of move on to your next section of the letter, unless you have more that you want to talk about with this.
No, I would just sort of briefly add, and I apologize for how immodest this must be to recommend my own books and my own research, but in addition to the letter I wrote on the CES Letters website, I would be remiss if I did not also recommend a book that I recently co-authored with 3 of my colleagues, John Gee, Kerry Muhlestein, and John Thompson, all also Egyptologists, incidentally. We published it through BYU Studies. As a matter of fact, Steve Harper was our great editor who helped us get this book project through the finish line. It's called A Guide to the Book of Abraham. It's available online on the BYU Studies website. And you can also purchase physical copies from them as well.
I'm sure the library has some.
Library probably has them. Yeah, absolutely. So, and we lay out sort of in more detail. I just am trying to kind of keep it condensed here for the podcast, but we lay out what we mean when we say that these unexamined assumptions have been presented as fact before, including the one we just read from Jeremy Runnels, and we lay out our case for why those assumptions are problematic. So that's all I would sort of add to this section. I would just also want to emphasize that the church itself does not take a position on how the Book of Abraham is translated. It affirms it was done by the inspiration of God, by the gift and power of God, by the power of revelation. That's what Joseph Smith said about it. That's what myself and my co-authors on this book all believe about it. But beyond that, there's still a lot of debate and question, right? Mm-hmm. So the church's gospel topics essay on the Book of Abraham, I think, does a pretty good job laying out some of the different theories people have and the evidence for and against them. And this is just to say we should not become dogmatic on this point, which is precisely what the CES letter does.
Right.
And we shouldn't become dogmatic precisely because we don't know everything quite yet. There still are gaps in our knowledge. And so it's best to have caution for now as we proceed forward. And so when you hear claims like what you see in the CES letter about these very sort of finite, totalistic, almost dogmatic claims, I would urge listeners a bit of skepticism because they can find differing perspectives out there, well-reasoned perspectives and interpretations of the data we have that accord with the faithful perspective or understanding of the Book of Abraham.
Mm-hmm. Powerful. And I would also like to add, I know we're getting Kerry Muhlestein. He's going to be helping me out with the section as well. And I think John Thompson might be as well. I'm not confident on that. And so we have the experts in this fact. As you proceed with the letter, and let's start looking at what do we know and how do we know that, you dive into the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And these, as a person who's been a member of the church since I was born, this was my favorite part of all of Scripture when I was in primary. Opening up and seeing these pictures and what in the world are these things? So as we get started, could you just describe a little bit what are these and what are some of the issues that people have with them? What are the issues the CES letter has with them?
So very basically, the facsimiles are pictures, right? So a facsimile is a copy. That's what a facsimile is or means, right? You probably don't know what this is, and most of our listeners, our younger listeners, you probably don't know what a fax machine is or was. You probably heard of it, right? Something your parents or your grandparents had. So a fax machine, the name comes from facsimile, a facsimile machine, a machine that makes a facsimile copy of a document. Okay. So Joseph Smith receives these Egyptian papyri in July of 1835. He purchases them and he begins his translation of the Book of Abraham. And these papyri scrolls had pictures on them. Egyptologists call them vignettes, right? We have these fancy terms for these things, but they're basically pictures, illustrations on these papyrus rolls. when the Book of Abraham was published in 1842 in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith had a Latter-day Saint named Reuben Hedlock make woodcuts, so copies, right, of these illustrations, and they turned them into facsimiles that were printed with the translation of the Book of Abraham in the Times and Seasons in the church's newspaper that then later was turned into the Pearl Grey Price, canonized in the Pearl Grey Price, right? So that's basically what they are. They're pictures, right, that have accompanied our text since 1842. They were made from images found in the papyrus scrolls that Joseph Smith had, and they are used to illustrate the content of the Book of Abraham. So facsimile 1 corresponds with Abraham chapter 1, which is the early life and sacrifice of Abraham. Facsimile 2 correlates with the astronomical and sort of cosmological concepts that's talked about in Abraham chapter 3, right, with like Kolob and the stars and things like that. And facsimile 3 depicts Abraham in King Pharaoh's court discussing astronomy or teaching the Egyptians astronomy. But what's interesting is that is actually not in our published Book of Abraham text. We don't have a narrative component that goes with that facsimile, which indicates either Joseph Smith had translated that material and it was subsequently lost and unpublished, or that's what he meant to come to in the translation later, right? So that gives us a sense for where the story of the Book of Abraham was going before it. So right now, the Book of Abraham, the way it's published, it cuts off in the middle of Adam naming all the animals in the Garden of Eden, right? But presumably, because of facsimile 3, at some point, we were going to have a narrative depiction of Abraham teaching the Egyptians astronomy, but we don't actually get that. So those are 3 facsimiles, right? And that's how they work in our Book of Abraham text. They're meant to illustrate the text we have in our Pearl Grey Price. Now, here's why it's controversial for some and why it's a big question for many. Egyptologists have looked at these facsimiles, and they have given interpretations of these images that vary differently from how that vary considerably differently from how Joseph Smith interpreted these images, right? So facsimile 1, which Joseph Smith interprets as a scene depicting the near sacrifice of Abraham, Egyptologists instead say that this is a scene showing the resurrection of either the god Osiris or the deceased owner of the papyrus that this image was connected to, right? Facsimile 2 is what Egyptologists call a hypocephalus. It was a type of document that was placed either under or near the head of a mummy or a deceased person who was buried with it. The word hypocephalus, it's a fancy Greek word meaning under the head, right? Since it was placed under or near the head of the deceased. And there are varying interpretations of what the figures on that might mean from an Egyptological perspective, but most of them don't agree with how Joseph Smith interprets these figures, at least sort of on the surface. And then facsimile 3, which Joseph Smith identifies as Abraham teaching astronomy in the king's court, Egyptologists interpret as what's sometimes erroneously, I think, called a judgment scene, where the deceased is being judged before the throne of the god Osiris. Instead, it's probably, from the Egyptological perspective, more accurate to describe it as a presentation scene, where the deceased is being brought into the presence of the god Osiris and presented to him as he becomes unified with him in the afterlife. So that's kind of in a nutshell what the controversy is. And Egyptologists, since at least like the 1860s, I think is the earliest I have, or we have on record, that I've read of Egyptologists critiquing Joseph Smith's interpretations of the facsimiles, right? So since at least the 1860s or 70s, Egyptologists have raised an eyebrow at Joseph Smith's interpretation, or they have criticized his interpretation, and that controversy continues today. Without getting too much wrapped up into it, right, because this could be a whole different little wormhole we get into, I would just once again point out the fact that Latter-day Saint Egyptologists, while acknowledging that the differences you have in Joseph Smith's interpretations and in Egyptologists' interpretations, a number of Latter-day Saint Egyptologists, myself included, have pointed out that there are numerous instances where these interpretations converge, and where Joseph Smith's interpretations do find some basis or grounding with what we understand these documents are and how they functioned and the interpretation of these figures, right? Again, I'll recommend to listeners the book that myself and my colleagues put out about 2 years ago on this. We have a whole section on the facsimiles. We go figure by figure and show examples of where Joseph Smith's interpretation finds convergence or harmony with our Egyptological understanding of what these figures may have meant. So again, I'm not saying this therefore proves it's all true, right? This proves he's a prophet or whatever. But what this does mean is that, once again, the CES Letters' simplistic, dogmatic approach to the facsimiles, where the author says that he got nothing right, that's just not true. This does not prove that Joseph Smith is a prophet or he got everything right. I'm not claiming that. But what I am saying is that the simplistic, dogmatic narrative and claims made by the CES letter are not founded. They're not well-founded.
Mm-hmm.
There are places where Joseph Smith's interpretations do converge with Egyptological knowledge. That, to me, says that something is going on here beyond Joseph Smith just was simply guessing and happened to get a few things right, and that rather, I believe Joseph Smith, as an inspired prophet, was able to find compelling connections between this Book of Abraham text that he revealed or translated and these ancient Egyptian images which he interpreted. He was inspired to find a syncretistic sort of harmony between them in ways that are fascinating and interesting. So, yeah, I would say, again, at the risk of being immodest, check out our book where we discuss this in detail. I give also some examples in my written comments responding to the CES letter to show some examples. And as people are deciding what they believe and sort of where they fall down on this, they just have to keep this information front of mind, right? They can't pretend like it doesn't exist. They can't pretend like it's not there, which is what the CES letter wants you to do. That has to be acknowledged and grappled with, whichever side of the debate you end up falling down on.
Right. And one sentence I'd like to quote you from this letter that I appreciate is you say, in either case, the CES letter has not been updated to reflect the current state of knowledge.
Yes.
And to me, that's the important thing when it comes to really academia as a whole and as an Egyptologist, is we're still learning.
Absolutely.
And it's okay that we don't currently know every single thing about it, because we have researchers like you who are on the ground trying to figure out all of this stuff. So I appreciate your statement in that. It's okay that we're updating our knowledge.
Right. And I would just want to add to that, and I say this with students that ask me or others that ask me this question, I completely acknowledge that we are not at a place right now where I can point to every last little thing in the Book of Abraham has proof for it or has some kind of confirmation or has evidence for it, right? I'm not here to say that. But in the long trajectory, the long arc of studies on the Book of Abraham, the text is looking better with time.
Mm-hmm.
And so is Joseph Smith, right? If it's like with the Book of Mormon, if this was fraudulent, if Joseph Smith just made this all up, we would not expect this to be the case. Where as the body of knowledge grows and as our understanding of the ancient world grows, the Book of Abraham looks better and better with time, right? That should not be the case if this is all just a big hoax. So again, that says to me that there's something here that is genuine, that encourages me to continue my study, even while acknowledging that at the moment, I don't have definitive answers to everything. Mm. And we very well may not have definitive answers to everything in this lifetime. I certainly don't expect to have it in my lifetime. That's both a little bit frustrating, of course, but also really exciting, because that gives me something to wake up to every morning, to have some excitement and something interesting to look forward to is what can we learn more about this wonderful text we have. So, yes, dare I say the Book of Abraham ages like fine wine? I know as Latter-day Saints we don't drink wine, but to use that metaphor, it really does. The longer things progress, the more knowledge we gain. Joseph Smith's scriptural productions look better with time, and that to me is remarkable.
Right. I love that. And again, our invitation is to go and do further study yourself. Yes. This podcast is not going to be your end all be all. If you really want to know, you will take the time to learn and study this. So let's jump forward and continue on. The next section that you talk about are the names in the Book of Mormon. And
Abraham.
In the Book of Mormon. And the names in the Book of Abraham. And Jeremy Urnels in the CES letter, he claims that the names in the Book of Abraham are, quote, gibberish.
Gibberish, right.
And some of these names include, I'm not even going to try and read them, actually, because some of them look hard. Koab is one.
Yep.
Alea.
Yep.
Is that
Alea? Sure. Yeah.
Arita.
Mm-hmm.
Just long story short, a handful.
There's a handful of names, yep.
And he calls them gibberish. Could you speak on that for just a few minutes?
I can, yes. So you have in the book of Abraham several unique names. So you have the names of these gods in Abraham chapter 1, right? Elkanah, Libnah, Mamachra, Korash, and a god named Pharaoh. So you have these names of these gods in Abraham 1. In Abraham 3, you have the names of celestial bodies, Kolob, Shaneha, Oleah, Chalbeam, right? You have, and people kind of scratch their heads like, oh, that's kind of an interesting sounding name. Well, Jeremy Reynolds claims that it's all, quote, gibberish, as you just read there. I'm here to say that once again, is way overreaching, okay? As a matter of fact, Elkanah is a established, attested Northwest Semitic deity. So there was a god named El, anciently, that the Canaanites worshipped, and the Canaanites and other Semitic peoples worshipped. And we have attestations of this name. El Konei Haaretz is where he appears in the Hebrew Bible. El Kunersha in cuneiform texts. So we have the attestation of this god, Elkanah. We have a chapter on it in our book, and others have written about that too. Libnah, right? Probable attestation of this god. Libnah's name derives from the Semitic root Laban, meaning to be white. Okay, so we could get down that rabbit hole, but for, there's probably attestation of this god. Mamachra, maybe there's some plausible attestation. We're not sure yet. There's some gaps in our knowledge. And then Korash, probably we have attestation from Hittite sources. And then the god Pharaoh. Well, Pharaoh is a well-attested Egyptian name. So, okay, not too bad, right? 4 out of the 5 names. We have either bullseye-directed attestation or plausible attestation of the names of these gods. So pretty good for Joseph Smith, right? Who supposedly is just making up gibberish. So let's move then to the astronomical names in Abraham chapter 3. So Kolob, for example, myself and others have argued it could plausibly derive from the Proto-Afro-Asiatic root meaning to be near or to be close to something. We have a chapter in our book about this where we discuss the etymology for Kolob. That works really well, too, for the book of Abraham because in the book of Abraham, Kolob is the one near to God, right, in his close proximity. So there's sort of a play on words there. The name Shaneha, which is given as the name of the sun in Abraham chapter 3, that probably matches with the name for the sun's ecliptic as a test in Egyptian texts. So, right, as the sun, for any astronomy aficionados out there, the path that the sun traverses across the sky, that's called the sun's ecliptic, right? And it changes throughout the year, right, relative to the Earth's motion with the sun. And so they were tracking the path the sky takes, the ancient Egyptians were, and they had a name for that. That seems to match the name for the sun in the book of Abraham. So that's interesting. Kokabim, that's just good old Hebrew, Kokab, or in Hebrew and other Semitic languages. So that's not a problem. So the point is, once again, to say, the author of the CES letter just wildly overclaims the state of the evidence by saying that they're all just gibberish. As a matter of fact, many of them have either direct attestation or plausible attestation, which is pretty good for Joseph Smith, who again is supposed to be just making this up, right?
Right.
So that's a good example where the CES letter is not up to date on the most current scholarship. In fact, by the time it was written, it was already out of date in some respects because some of this knowledge we knew even before the CES letter was written, but it never accounted for that. And so that's precisely what I mean when I say, do not take the negative narrative presented in the CES letter at face value when it says it's all gibberish, it's all nonsense. Well, actually, it's not. There's some of it that has very plausible or direct attestation, and the CES letter needs to be honest about that, and we need to be honest about it with ourselves when we confront this as we decide what we believe and why we believe it.
Right. And something I'd like to point out, kind of going along with what you're saying, is the CES letter, it's framed as it comes from a seeker of truth, who's wanting to learn. And that's who we're trying to talk to, are these seekers of truth, specifically people like Jeremy Reynolds, who are searching for the truth. And he talks about in his letter how he searched for well over a year and studied these things for well over a year. I would like to point out, you have studied this one concept for much longer than 1 year. And while I don't want to talk poorly about anybody, you know more about this than he does. He spent, as he says, well over a year studying things from the First Vision, the Book of Mormon, the translators of the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, polygamy and polyandry, all of these things. You have spent years studying this one aspect. So you are a trusted voice. And I think it's important that we recognize the CES letter is not perfect, just as we aren't, just as the Book of Abraham may not be, as we're still trying to learn some of these things. But we do know a lot of these things, and it's important to recognize that the CES letter is not currently up to date. Moving forward, Jeremy Rennell's in the CES letter, he claims that, quote, even LDS Egyptologists acknowledge that there are serious problems with the Book of Abraham and Joseph's claims. Could you speak on that a little bit? Is that offensive as a Latter-day Egyptologist?
Yeah, so it is true that there are some Latter-day Saints who have gone through training in Egyptology and who have ended up on the other end of that as disbelieving or doubting the claims of the Book of Abraham, right, and the claims of Joseph Smith. So I'm not here to pretend like there's no controversy on that point, or that Latter-day Saints haven't come to different conclusions through their Egyptological studies. But I would like to point out that on the aggregate, at least to my personal knowledge, having worked with a lot of these people, being colleagues of theirs, co-authors, or knowing about them, most Latter-day Saints who have come out of training in Egyptology have remained believers, and not only remained believers, but have published favorably on the Book of Abraham, and either in print or have told me personally that their faith was increased as they saw what their studies illuminated about the Book of Abraham. So the CES letter points to one LDS Egyptologist, I should say, a fellow by the name of Stephen Thompson, who went through training, I believe, in the late 80s to mid-1990s in Egyptology. And in, I think, 95 or 96, he published an article critiquing the Book of Abraham from the perspective of Egyptology. That's the one that the CES letter sort of references or links to. Now, Stephen Thompson, of course, is a voice we should consider. He does raise good points and good questions. But that is one article written now like almost 30 years ago. And that's what the CES letter has as its evidence of many LDS Egyptologists are doing this. Well, with all due respect to Stephen Thompson, I can point on the other end of this equation myself, John Gee, John Thompson, Kerry Muhlestein, Michael Rhodes, David Calabro, Quentin Barney, and on and on and on of Latter-day Saints who have training in Egyptology who are absolute steadfast believers, right? So I don't like to play this game of, well, my scholar trumps your scholar, right? And so I don't like this tactic that the CES letter takes. What really matters is the quality of the arguments made by the various scholars, right? Not that I have more scholars than you, or, well, these guys don't believe anymore, therefore the whole thing. You get what I'm saying here? That should not be the way that we approach this. Rather, we should take each individual author and weigh the merits of their arguments on their own based on the evidence and based on the reasoning that they present. But if we do want to play this game, which I guess the CES letter wants to do, then for every disaffected Latter-day Saint Egyptologist who came to doubt or disbelieve the Book of Abraham, I can stack up others who still believe it very strongly.
Right. And as you point out in your letter, the CES letter does not cite your work or the facts that have been discovered by you or other Egyptologists who are still faithful Latter-day Saints. And it even goes out and it quotes part of the gospel topic essay on the Book of Abraham. Right. But as you mentioned in your letter, it quotes a small sound bite, trying to make it sound damning and a little bit more scary and more dramatic, when, as people will notice as they read your entire letter, you give the entire context for that one little portion. Yeah. And you say, quote, the fact that Jeremy reduced the church's overall thoughtful, nuanced essay on the Book of Abraham into a damning soundbite is characteristic of how the entire CES letter works. Truth seekers need balanced, accurate information on controversial subjects like the Book of Abraham. And so I think that this kind of just, and I guess is just a second witness to what you're saying, is the CES letter fails to mention that there's more than just this one guy. Yeah. And it fails to mention that there are thousands of pages of research from all of these other people who contradict this one person as well. Like I said, almost now 6 decades of like serious hard-hitting scholarship on the Book of Abraham since, we'll say, sort of the late 1960s, right? To isolate this one scholar who came to some particular conclusions, which again,
I'm not here to bash this one scholar or to denigrate him in any ways, but to reduce all of the field of study to this one guy who had a negative assessment of the Book of Abraham, to do that and to ignore the rest of it, it's just simply dishonest. To pretend like there isn't all this other stuff out there that contradicts what this one negative scholar, or this one scholar who had negative things to say about the Book of Abraham, right? And also, I absolutely agree, and I wrote it, so I stick with what I wrote when I said that this is emblematic of what the CES letter does. So the way that it quotes the Gospel Topics essay that the church produced on the Book of Abraham, again, it's just dishonest, right? It isolates, as I recall, maybe you have it there with you, but it isolates the church saying that none of the characters translate as the Book of Abraham, right? And that the papyri date to centuries after Abraham. Do you have by chance a quote right there?
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, please.
So this is what Jeremy Reynolds quotes in the CES letter. None of the characters on the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. Mormon and non-Mormon Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham, though there is no unanimity, goodness gracious, even among non-Mormon scholars about the proper interpretation of the vignettes on these fragments. Scholars have identified the papyrus fragments as part of standard funerary texts that were deposited with mummified bodies. These fragments date to between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, long after Abraham lived.
Yeah. So that's the big scary quote that the CES isolates, the CES letter isolates, and others do this as well, to make it seem as though the church is finally fessing up to, the fact that this is a big problem or whatever.
Right.
Keep reading the essay, and it goes on and it gives paragraphs and paragraphs to explain why this is not game over for Joseph Smith or the Book of Abraham, right? And I quoted verbatim in my letter to show people how much context Reynolds is leaving out here. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I, of all people, and my colleagues, we recognize the exact same thing, and we acknowledge the same thing. Yes, the papyrus fragments do not translate as the Book of Abraham. There's differences in interpretation of these vignettes or these illustrations that don't match how Joseph Smith did it. That's completely fine. We acknowledge that. But there's so much more consideration to this than just that fact that the CES letter latches onto, precisely because it's a damning soundbite. It's a damning soundbite. It's a damning little juicy, piece of sort of gotcha soundbite that scares people when they read the CES letter. So hopefully listeners, as they read my response to the CES letter, they will see just how dishonest Reynolds is when he quotes that in isolation without following up and showing where the church's essay then explains why this is not game over for the Mormons, basically, right? And how there's much more to consider here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephen, I love that, and this has been an excellent time with you. Do you have any final thoughts as we kind of conclude this episode about everything we've talked about?
I would just end by quoting again Hugh Nibley, the man who I discovered as a teenager, who kind of first introduced me to all this sort of this world or all of this material. Hugh Nibley was fond of saying, when you have outstanding questions or uncertainties about the scriptures, ask the right questions and keep looking. That was sort of Hugh Nibley's frame of mind, or his paradigm that he operated under as a scholar. That's the frame of mind that I try to operate as, both as a scholar and as a believer, as a believing active Latter-day Saint. I have questions, certainly, about the Book of Abraham. I'm sure many of our listeners have questions about the Book of Abraham. That's okay. It's okay to have those questions. You should be asking the right questions, or the better questions, and keep looking with what we know and what we perhaps will know in the future, right? So in other words, I like to tell people, don't give up on the Book of Abraham, as beleaguered and as belittled as it is sometimes. Don't give up on it just yet. When you read scary sounding things like what's in the CES letter, just know there's this whole other world that's available for you to explore as you navigate what you believe and why you believe it. That paradigm has served me well over the years. It's what keeps me going, right, in my academic pursuits. And it is both satisfying for me from a faith perspective, and it is also encouraging from an intellectual perspective as well. And so hopefully will be for others.
Well, I love that. Well, thank you, Stephen, very much. And I want to thank our listeners for listening today. I hope that you were able to learn a little bit more, that you were able to gain a greater perspective when it comes to the Book of Abraham. As we conclude, I'd also just like to invite you to make sure to continue your study. A lot of the people on our Instagram are saying we're not answering these things to the full extent. And you know what? We're probably not, because we have 1 hour and we have just short letters and responses, but we give you the resources that you can find your answers. There are answers to your questions, but it takes effort and it takes time. And if you're not willing to put in that time and effort, you probably don't really care to know the actual answers to these questions. So that's our invitation. Continue your study. Make sure to go read the letter that Stephen has written. And after listening to this, if you still want to continue to learn more, reach out to us on our website or on our social media pages, and we'll try and answer your questions. Additionally, this is one of 3 episodes with Stephen. We'll have more to come, so make sure you continue to listen and make sure you share this with the truth seekers in your life. Thank you very much.